The sun hung low over El Paso, bleeding fire across the desert sky as the town's main street shimmered with heat. Dust swirled between the weathered boardwalks, and the rickety signs above the saloons creaked in the dry wind. Horses shifted nervously at the hitching posts, their ears flicking as if they sensed the storm about to break. Every set of eyes in town was fixed on the street, where one man stood in the center, waiting. John Wesley Hardin, a name that carried death in its echo. He was broad-shouldered, his dark hat pulled low over eyes as cold as a winter river. His hand hovered near the worn grip of his Colt, a weapon that had claimed more lives than most men could count. Across from him, 4 gunmen stepped into the road, their boots raising puffs of dust with every step. At their head was Kincaid, a scarred brute with a voice like gravel and a stare that promised blood. "Hardin," he called, his words carrying over the hushed town. "You won't leave this place alive." The townsfolk pressed against doorways and windows, holding their breath. Children were dragged back inside, and shutters slammed shut. The piano in the saloon fell silent, as if even music dared not interrupt. For a long moment, time itself seemed to pause, the world balanced on the edge of violence. Hardin didn't flinch. He spat once into the dust, a gesture of contempt, and his voice came low and steady. "Plenty of men have said that, Kincaid. None lived long enough to prove it true." His words were quiet, but they cut sharper than any blade. The gunmen shifted uneasily, fingers twitching at their sides. Kincaid sneered, but in his eyes flickered something dangerous, hesitation. Hardin's legend weighed heavy, not just on the men before him, but on the town itself. He was a man who walked with death at his side, a man who could turn silence into a graveyard with a twitch of a finger. Then, in a heartbeat, the world erupted. A bird startled from the rooftops, wings beating frantically, and as if on cue, the street exploded with thunder. Pistols roared, fire spit from muzzles, and the air filled with choking smoke. Hardin's hand blurred faster than the eye could follow. One shot, then another, each finding its mark with deadly precision. The first gunman fell clutching his chest, the second spun and crumpled into the dust, his revolver clattering useless beside him. The crowd gasped, screams mixing with the thunder of gunfire, as Hardin pivoted smoothly, his long coat swirling like a shadow. But Kincaid was no ordinary foe. He barked an order and dropped to one knee, his rifle already aimed. The shot split the air, and Hardin staggered back, the brim of his hat flying from his head as the bullet grazed past. Blood trickled down his temple, hot against the desert wind. Still, his eyes never wavered. His Colt rose again, steady as the heartbeat of death itself. Smoke thickened, the townsfolk ducked for cover, and in the chaos, no one could see clearly who still stood. Then, silence. The ringing of gunfire faded into the hiss of wind sweeping through the street. Shapes loomed in the haze, bodies lying still, blood seeping into the thirsty earth. Hardin's silhouette emerged, his chest heaving, his revolver smoking in his hand. He had survived the first storm, but his steps faltered, his boots dragging through the dust. For the first time, he looked vulnerable, mortal beneath the weight of legend. The crowd whispered, torn between awe and terror. Was this the beginning of his end? From behind him, through the clearing smoke, another gun cracked. The crowd screamed as a single bullet cut through the air, aimed squarely at Hardin's back. He turned, too late. The shot was already flying. The gunshot ripped through the street, louder than thunder. Hardin twisted, his body reacting faster than thought, but the bullet still found him. It slammed into his shoulder, spinning him half around and driving him to one knee. The Colt slipped from his grasp, clattering into the dust. The townsfolk gasped as blood spread across his shirt, staining it deep crimson. For a heartbeat, silence reigned, then a cruel laugh echoed from the saloon porch. Out of the smoke stepped a lean figure with a rifle cradled in his arms. Elias Crow, Kincaid's right hand, known in 3 states for ambush killings and backshooting. His grin was wide and wolfish as he leveled the rifle again. "The great John Wesley Hardin," he sneered. "Bleeding in the dirt like the rest of us." Hardin clenched his jaw, forcing himself to his feet. His shoulder burned, his vision swam, but his spirit remained iron. Slowly, he straightened, eyes blazing beneath the brimless shadow of his head. "If you're gonna kill me, Crow," he rasped, "don't talk it to death." His voice, though ragged, cut through the dust-choked air, silencing even the whispers of the crowd. Crow smirked and pulled the trigger. The rifle roared, but Hardin was already moving. In a flash of instinct, his boot hooked the Colt in the dirt, kicking it into the air. His good hand snatched the gun mid-spin, and with the speed of a striking rattlesnake, he fired. The bullet struck true, tearing into Crow's chest. The outlaw staggered backward, rifle falling, his grin vanishing into a gasp of disbelief before he collapsed on the porch. The townsfolk erupted, some shouting in awe, others fleeing in terror. Hardin swayed on his feet, the world spinning. His shoulder throbbed with each heartbeat, and his breaths came ragged and shallow. He had won, but only barely. His enemies lay dead or dying, yet his body screamed with pain, and he knew more would come. Men like Kincaid always had more riders waiting in the hills, more killers hungry for revenge or glory. Sheriff Jacobs finally stepped into the street, his badge glinting, his face pale. He looked from the bodies to Hardin, then back again. "You brought death to my town, Hardin," he said, voice trembling. "And it won't end here." Hardin holstered his Colt, blood dripping from his sleeve. His eyes, cold and steady, met the sheriff's. "Death follows me everywhere, Sheriff. Best pray you don't stand in its way." With that, he turned and limped toward the livery, each step leaving a trail of crimson in the dust. The town watched in silence, knowing they had witnessed not just another gunfight, but a battle in a war that was far from over. As Hardin reached the edge of town, a rider thundered down the trail, dust billowing behind him. He reined up hard, shouting so all could hear, "Hardin! Kincaid's brothers are comin'. 40 men, armed to the teeth. And they aim to kill you before dawn." The desert night fell heavy over El Paso, the stars glittering like cold steel above the black horizon. Hardin sat alone in the livery, his wounded shoulder bandaged with torn cloth, his Colt resting in his lap. His mind raced. Kincaid's brothers were coming, 40 men hardened by blood and driven by vengeance. Against numbers like that, even Hardin's legend might not save him. The horses in their stalls shifted nervously, sensing the storm of violence rolling closer. Hardin lit a match, the glow painting deep shadows across his scarred face, and drew a slow breath. 40 men, he muttered. "I'll send every last one to hell if I have to." His voice was calm, but deep inside, he felt the weight of his mortality pressing against him. For all his reputation, he was still a man, and no man stood alone against an army forever. Outside, the town buzzed with fear. Some packed wagons under cover of darkness, fleeing before the riders arrived. Others boarded their doors, clutching rifles and praying for dawn. Yet, a few brave souls watched Hardin from the windows, torn between terror and admiration. He was no hero, but in the cruel silence of the frontier night, he was the only shield standing between them and slaughter. As the hours dragged on, the thunder of hooves finally echoed across the desert. A cloud of dust rose under the moonlight, and the faint gleam of rifles and pistols caught the starlight. The Kincaid brothers were coming, and they weren't coming alone. 40 riders fanned across the plain like wolves closing in on their prey, their leader's voice carrying over the wind, "Bring me Hardin's head!" Hardin stepped into the street, his silhouette framed by the lantern glow behind him. His Colt gleamed in his good hand, the barrel aimed low, steady. His shoulder ached, but his resolve was unbroken. He looked down the darkened street, 40 guns riding hard toward him, and allowed himself a thin, grim smile. "So this is how it ends," he whispered. "A fight worth dying for." The riders thundered closer, the earth trembling beneath their charge. Townsfolk screamed and scattered as the street filled with the sound of fury, hooves pounding, rifles cocking, voices shouting. Hardin squared his shoulders, feet planted in the dust, ready to meet them all. The night would burn with gunfire, and the legend of John Wesley Hardin would be written in blood. Just as Hardin raised his gun to fire, a shadow slipped from the alley beside him. A voice hissed in his ear, "You don't have to fight alone." Hardin turned to see a figure cloaked in dust and moonlight, an ally from his past, a gunslinger he thought long dead. The riders thundered closer, the earth quaking under the weight of 40 hooves, and Hardin braced himself for the onslaught. But then, from the shadows, that familiar voice cut through the chaos like a blade. "You don't have to fight alone." Hardin turned sharply, Colt raised, and his eyes widened. Standing in the alley's glow was Cole Dawson, a gunslinger Hardin had once ridden with during the blood-soaked trails of Texas. Cole had been thought dead for 5 years, cut down in a border raid. But here he stood, his face hardened by scars, his eyes cold steel under the brim of his hat. "Cole," Hardin breathed, his voice edged with disbelief. "I buried you myself." A thin grin spread across Dawson's face as he drew his revolver, the steel gleaming under the lantern light. "You buried a man who didn't want to be found. Tonight, you'll be glad I came back." He spun the revolver once, cocking the hammer with the ease of a man born to kill. The riders bore down, the street filling with the roar of horses. Hardin's gaze locked on his old friend. 40 men, Cole. They'll cut us to ribbons. Cole's grin only widened. Then we'd best make it 40 funerals. The 2 men stepped side by side into the street, their silhouettes etched against the moonlit dust. The townsfolk watched from shuttered windows, unable to look away. Gun barrels glinted, hooves thundered like war drums, and 2 outlaws stood alone, ready to face the charge. The first shots rang out, bullets shrieking through the night. Hardin and Dawson fired in perfect rhythm, their guns roaring like thunderclaps. Riders screamed as bullets tore them from saddles. Horses reared, chaos exploded, but still the swarm pushed forward, relentless as a flood. Shells clinked to the ground as Hardin reloaded with lightning speed, his Colt flashing again and again. Dawson's revolver sang death beside him, every shot a cold reminder of why men once called him the Shadow Rider. Bodies tumbled, smoke filled the air, and yet for every rider that fell, more came charging through. The earth itself seemed to quake under the fury of the Kincaid's vengeance. Hardin's shoulder burned with each pull of the trigger, his vision blurring with sweat and blood. Then, out of the dust, the Kincaid brothers themselves appeared, 3 grim riders at the head of the charge, rifles raised, faces carved with vengeance. Their leader, Jedediah Kincaid, bellowed above the din, "Hardin, we'll hang your hide from our barn door." The 2 gunslingers stood their ground, blood and fire painting the night. But the swarm pressed closer, the odds overwhelming. As the riders closed in, a stick of dynamite whistled through the air, landing right at Hardin's boots. The fuse hissed like a rattler in the dirt. Hardin's eyes locked on the sparking dynamite at his feet, seconds from detonation. Without hesitation, he snatched it up and hurled it into the charging swarm. A heartbeat later, the night exploded. The blast lit the street like lightning, fire blooming outward in a wave of death. Horses screamed, riders were thrown, and the ground shook as bodies tumbled through the flames. Smoke and shrapnel filled the air, and when it cleared, half the charge lay in ruins, screams fading into silence. Hardin staggered back, coughing through the haze, his Colt still clutched tight. Dawson grinned through the smoke, his face blackened with soot. "Now that's the Hardin I remember." But there was no time to breathe. The remaining riders regrouped, fury burning in their eyes. Jedediah Kincaid, untouched and howling like a mad dog, spurred his horse straight through the flames, rifle raised. His brothers flanked him, their weapons barking, bullets sparking against wood and stone. Hardin dove behind a water trough, splinters flying as rounds punched through the wood. Dawson dropped low beside him, reloading with deadly calm. "They won't stop, John," he said. "Not until your bones bleach in the sun." Hardin gritted his teeth, blood dripping from his bandaged shoulder. "Then let's give them a reason to regret riding tonight." Together, they rose, guns blazing. The trough shattered as the 2 outlaws unleashed a storm of lead. One Kincaid brother tumbled from his saddle, a bullet tearing through his chest. The second roared with rage, his shot grazing Dawson's hat clean off. The fight raged like hellfire, every corner of the street swallowed in chaos. Then, in the din, a rifle cracked from the rooftops. Dawson jerked, his body twisting as the bullet ripped into his side. He crumpled into the dirt with a cry, his revolver slipping from his grasp. "Cole!" Hardin roared, dragging him behind cover as more shots rained down from above. Through the smoke, a figure appeared on the roofline, a woman in a long duster coat, her rifle smoking in the moonlight. The town gasped as her voice carried, "Hardin, your time's over." Hardin froze as the lantern light caught her face. It was Eleanor Bishop, the bounty hunter who had sworn to see him hang, and the woman he once loved. Hardin's heart stuttered in his chest as he looked up at the rooftop. Eleanor Bishop, her auburn hair tied back, her eyes hard as flint, stood with her rifle trained on him. The years had sharpened her into something fierce and unyielding, but beneath the grit, he could still see the woman who had once shared his nights beneath desert stars. "Eleanor," Hardin muttered, his voice ragged. She didn't flinch. Her rifle never wavered. "You've left a trail of bodies from here to Abilene, John. $40 a head," they said. "I'll take every damn one of them when you're dead." Dawson groaned beside him, blood seeping through his shirt. Hardin pressed a hand to the wound, his mind torn between past and present. He remembered her laughter once, soft and sweet, before the guns and the blood. Now, her eyes held nothing but fire. "You gonna kill me, Eleanor?" he called, standing slowly from cover, arms open, his Colt hanging at his side. "Or are you just gonna make me remember what I lost?" Her lips curled in a bitter smile. "You already lost it, John. The day you chose the gun over me." The Kincaid seized their moment, spurring forward with renewed fury, their riders screaming for blood. Bullets tore through the street, townsfolk scattering in terror. Eleanor fired, the shot splintering the ground at Hardin's boots. "Stand still, damn you!" she shouted, her voice cracking with rage. Hardin rolled into the dust, returning fire, his Colt blazing. Riders fell, Dawson managed a weak shot from the ground, and chaos swallowed the street once more. Eleanor reloaded with ruthless precision, her rifle booming like judgment itself. But then, something shifted. As Jedediah Kincaid aimed his rifle at Hardin's head, Eleanor's gun swung, not at John, but at the outlaw leader. Her shot rang out, striking Jedediah's arm and spinning him from his saddle. The crowd gasped. Hardin froze, eyes locked on her. "Why, Eleanor?" Her jaw clenched, tears brimming but unshed. "Because no one kills you but me." As Jedediah struggled to his feet, bellowing for his men to finish the job, the sound of 100 hooves echoed from the horizon. Another force was riding in. No one knew if they came as friend or executioner. The thunder of hooves grew louder, rolling across the plains like a storm. Dust clouds swirled in the moonlight, and every soul in the street froze, their guns falling silent for a heartbeat as they turned toward the sound. Hardin's hand clenched tighter on his Colt. His bloodied shoulder burned, Dawson lay half-conscious at his feet, and Eleanor's rifle gleamed cold under the lantern glow. The question struck every heart in Dusty Creek: were these new riders saviors, or the hammer of doom? Jedediah Kincaid spat blood into the dirt, his wounded arm hanging limp. "Reinforcements," he growled. "My kin ride tonight." The truth came crashing down as the figures crested the rise, a company of ranch riders, Kincaid men armed to the teeth. Their banners fluttered, rifles glinting, faces twisted with vengeance. There were at least 30 of them, and they came with murder in their eyes. The townsfolk gasped. Some slammed shutters. Others whispered prayers. And in the middle of it all, John Wesley Hardin holstered his smoking Colt and lifted his chin against the tide. Eleanor's voice was cold steel. "This is the end, John. You can't outshoot an army." Hardin looked at her, his eyes burning with that strange mix of defiance and sorrow that only a man who's lived by the gun could carry. "I don't need to outshoot them all. Just the ones who aim first." Dawson coughed, spitting blood, but managed a grin. "Hell, John, 30 men? We've done worse." The riders fanned into the street, their horses snorting, rifles cocking in the lantern light. Jedediah raised his good arm and pointed at Hardin. "String him up. Tonight, the deadliest outlaw dies." The first rifle cracked, the bullet screaming past Hardin's ear. The street erupted in chaos once more. Just as the Kincaid army surged forward, the church bell rang out across the night, slow, solemn, and deliberate. Every head turned. Who dared sound the bell at such an hour? And why? The bell tolled again, deep and mournful, echoing through the dusty streets. The Kincaid riders faltered, their charge slowing, eyes darting toward the old church at the edge of town. Its silhouette loomed dark against the moon, the bell rope swaying as if pulled by unseen hands. Hardin narrowed his eyes. He knew the sound wasn't divine warning, it was a message. Someone was signaling, and he had an idea who. From the shadows of the churchyard, a lantern swung high. Then another. And another. Shapes emerged, hard men with dust-stained faces and revolvers at their hips. Outlaws. Hardin recognized them instantly. Remnants of gangs he'd once ridden with, men who owed him debts paid in blood. The leader, a scarred brute named Silas Cray, stepped forward, his shotgun glinting. "This ain't your town, Kincaid. Tonight, the odds are even." Gasps rippled through the townsfolk. The churchyard filled with at least 20 outlaws, weapons leveled. Their allegiance was uncertain. Outlaws never fought for justice. But they weren't about to let a ranching empire like Kincaid's crush their kind without a fight. Jedediah's face twisted in rage. "You'll hang with him, Cray," he snarled. But Silas only spat in the dirt. "Maybe. But not tonight." Gunfire erupted, shattering the stillness. Outlaws and ranchers clashed in a storm of lead. Horses reared, bullets punched into wood and flesh, and Dusty Creek became a battlefield. Hardin fired into the melee, his Colt barking again and again. Dawson, pale but stubborn, managed to get back on his feet, his revolver blazing. Eleanor stayed perched on the rooftop, her rifle dealing death with every shot, though her eyes never left Hardin. The street filled with screams and smoke, the night alight with muzzle flashes. Bodies fell, the air reeked of gunpowder, and through it all, Hardin felt the cold weight of inevitability. Because he knew something none of them wanted to admit, when the dust cleared, friend and foe alike would want him dead. As the gunfight reached its fever pitch, a burning wagon, lit ablaze in the chaos, rolled loose down the hill, straight toward the saloon where the townsfolk hid. Hardin saw it first. He had only seconds to act. The wagon barreled forward, flames whipping into the night, the horses long since cut loose. Sparks showered the street as it thundered toward the saloon doors. Inside, terrified townsfolk huddled for safety, men, women, and children unaware that fire and death bore down upon them. Hardin didn't hesitate. With a roar, he broke from cover, sprinting across the street, bullets whizzing past his head. His boots pounded the dirt, his lungs burned, but his focus never wavered. In that moment, the outlaw wasn't thinking of his own legend. He was thinking of the innocents who'd die screaming if he didn't act. He leapt, grabbing the wagon side, muscles straining as he hauled himself up. The heat scorched his skin, smoke choking his throat. With one arm, he yanked the reins, jerking the wagon sideways. The burning beast groaned, wheels splintering, sparks flying. At the last second, it careened off course, smashing into a water trough with a hiss of steam. The crowd erupted in cries of relief. But relief was fleeting. A bullet slammed into the wagon's side inches from Hardin's head. He spun, Colt blazing, dropping the shooter where he stood. The battlefield raged hotter than ever. Cray's outlaws clashed with the Kincaid riders in a frenzy of blood. Dawson limped into the fray, refusing to go down. Eleanor's rifle cracked from above, her eyes unreadable as she covered Hardin's flank even while vowing to see him hang. And through the smoke, Jedediah Kincaid advanced, his face twisted with fury. Rifle raised, he bellowed above the carnage. "Hardin, you ain't no savior. You're death in a black hat, and tonight I'll bury you myself." The two men locked eyes, predator and predator, as the world burned around them. Their destinies had collided, and the showdown that had been building for years was finally here. Jedediah raised his rifle to fire, but before he could, a thunderous blast echoed from the church roof. The bullet struck him square in the chest. He staggered, coughing blood, but the shot hadn't come from Eleanor. Someone else had just joined the fight. The gunshot cracked like thunder, echoing across the battlefield. Jedediah Kincaid staggered, blood blooming across his chest, but he did not fall. His eyes burned with defiance even as his knees buckled. Every head turned toward the source of the shot. Standing tall on the church roof, long rifle still smoking, was Preacher Amos Clay, the fire and brimstone reverend of Dusty Creek. His voice rolled out over the chaos, deep and unyielding. "Enough blood has been spilled in this town. This ends tonight." The crowd froze. Even the Kincaid riders faltered, unsure whether to advance or retreat. The outlaws glanced at one another, their trigger fingers itchy but waiting. The whole of Dusty Creek seemed to hold its breath. But Hardin knew better. In the West, words didn't end bloodshed. Bullets did. Jedediah snarled through a mouthful of blood, raising his rifle with trembling hands. "You can't stop me, preacher. You can't stop him," he spat, his gaze locked on Hardin. "Death follows that man, and it always will." With a roar, he fired. The bullet screamed past Clay's shoulder, shattering the church bell in a shower of sparks. The toll of vengeance died with a final, broken clang. That was the signal. Chaos erupted again. Hardin dove for cover, rolling across the dirt, Colt barking as he fired into the charging Kincaid men. Clay's outlaws unleashed hell from the shadows. Eleanor's rifle cracked, each shot a death sentence. Dawson, pale as death but still grinning, fought like a man who knew this was his last stand. In the maelstrom, Hardin pushed forward, step by bloody step, until he stood face to face with Jedediah Kincaid in the middle of the street. The rancher was coughing blood, barely able to hold his rifle steady, but the fire in his eyes was still there. "You'll die a butcher, Hardin," Jedediah hissed. "Not a hero. Just another name on the gallows." Hardin's gaze was cold, unblinking. "I never asked to be a hero." The two men drew at the same instant. Jedediah's shot went wide, the pain in his chest stealing his aim. Hardin's bullet struck true, slamming into Jedediah's heart. The rancher fell to his knees, eyes wide with fury and disbelief, before collapsing into the dust. Silence followed. Then, like a wave, the Kincaid riders broke. Some fled into the night. Others threw down their rifles. Clay's men howled in triumph, but it was hollow. Too many bodies littered the street, too much blood stained the earth. Eleanor lowered her rifle, her eyes fixed on Hardin. "It's over," she whispered, though her voice carried more sorrow than relief. Hardin stood in the center of the carnage, chest heaving, smoke curling from his Colt. Around him lay the broken pieces of Dusty Creek, friends, enemies, innocents caught in the crossfire. He had survived, but at what cost? The preacher's voice broke the silence. "John Wesley Hardin," he called, "this town cannot hold you. Wherever you ride, death will follow. You must choose now, the road to damnation, or the chance to put your gun down forever." Hardin looked at Eleanor, at Dawson bleeding out in the dirt, at the frightened townsfolk peeking from the saloon. His legend had been carved in blood, but legends were double-edged. They drew fear, and they drew vengeance. He holstered his Colt with a slow, deliberate motion. "No man puts his gun down forever," he said quietly. "But maybe I can ride where it don't matter anymore." With that, he turned his back on Dusty Creek. His boots echoed in the silence, his silhouette framed by the burning horizon. Every eye followed him as he mounted his horse, black hat casting his face in shadow. The deadliest outlaw of the frontier rode away, his fate uncertain, his legend eternal. As Hardin disappeared into the night, a voice whispered among the townsfolk, "He'll be back. Death don't ride off into the sunset."